She was tired, but not just from work. From years of being told she was less. She wasn't a politician, not a celebrity, just a quiet woman on a crowded bus. But when she said just one word, no, she sparked a fire that would burn through history. This is not just about Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat. This is the untold story of her courage, her fear, her silence, and the revolution it awakened. You're watching Still Rise, where we tell the stories of silent courage that shaped the world. If you believe greatness doesn't shout, it whispers through actions, you're in the right place. The quiet strength in the Deep South, 1950s America, silence could be deadly. Rosa Louise Macaulay Parks was born in 1913 in Tuskegee, Alabama, a place soaked in the weight of Jim Crow laws, where signs dictated where a black child could sit, drink, or even walk. But Rosa wasn't loud. She wasn't rebellious. She grew up helping her grandfather stay up at night with a shotgun across his lap, waiting for the Klan to pass by. She watched injustice quietly, but she remembered everything. In Montgomery, she worked as a seamstress. She rode the bus every day. She knew the rules. Black passengers had to enter through the front to pay, then step off and re-enter through the back. If the bus was too crowded, they had to give up their seat for any white person who boarded later. Most people complied not because they agreed, because they were tired. Tired of the beatings, the jail, the humiliation. But Rosa had a quiet strength. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she was no longer willing to shrink. She joined the NAACP, not to lead, but to support. She became a secretary. She documented the stories others ignored. Stories of rape, murder, injustice. One of those stories was about Reese Taylor, a black woman abducted and gang-raped by white men. No arrests were ever made. Rosa investigated, wrote reports, knocked on doors, with calm fury. Every injustice added weight, every no justice added fire. But still, she waited. She believed change came slowly, through law, through persistence. But deep down, she knew a moment would come. A spark, a chair, a seat. That moment came on December 1st, 1955. She stepped onto the Cleveland Avenue bus like any other day. She paid. She took her seat, not in the white section, but in the colored section. A few stops later, the white section filled up. A white man boarded. The bus driver ordered her to move. She said one word, no. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it shook the country. She was arrested, fingerprinted, mugshotted. But that simple act of resistance was a volcano under the surface. What followed wasn't rage, it was organization. Rosa's arrest sparked a movement, but she didn't lead it loudly. She sat quietly as others gathered. Pastors, teachers, mothers, and one young preacher who would soon become a global name, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But this wasn't the end of Rosa's story. It was only the beginning. A world measured by skin. Rosa Parks was born into a world that had laws for skin. In Montgomery, Alabama, the signs were everywhere. White only, colored waiting room, even separate drinking fountains. But there was something more painful than the signs. The silence. White people pretended it was normal. Black people were told to survive it. Rosa, as a child, noticed the tension before she could name it. She watched her grandfather sit with a shotgun by the door at night. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. Lessons from her mother, Leona Edwards, Rosa's mother, was a teacher and her strongest protector. She told Rosa, "You are just as good as anyone else, even when the world tells you otherwise." But knowing it and living it were different. Rosa tried to study, tried to smile, tried to survive. But inside, something was growing, a quiet anger, calm resistance, a storm waiting for the right moment. Every day, Rosa walked miles to school while white children rode buses. Even as a teenager, she saw classmates jailed, beaten, or worse for simply not moving fast enough. Once, a white boy shoved her. She shoved him back. His mother threatened to press charges. When asked if she was scared, Rosa simply said, "I would rather be standing than live on my knees." That was her spirit, not loud, but unshakable. At age 19, Rosa married Raymond Parks, a quiet activist working with the NAACP, fighting to free the Scottsboro boys. This was Rosa's first real taste of structured resistance. And while Raymond spoke passionately, Rosa listened carefully. She began going to meetings, watching, learning. She didn't know it yet, but history was watching her too. Montgomery's bus system was a daily insult. Black riders made up 70% of the passengers, but they had to sit at the back and give up their seats at any time for white riders. Sometimes, they had to pay at the front, then exit and re-enter from the back, and if the driver drove off before they got back in, they just lost their ride. Rosa knew the drivers by name, and she remembered the one who humiliated her in 1943. He would later be the one to confront her again in 1955. Fate remembers everything. Many have said Rosa Parks refused to stand because she was tired. That's true, but not in the way people think. She wasn't physically tired. She was tired of the lies, tired of the fear, tired of being told she didn't matter, tired of standing when no one ever stood for her. That's a different kind of tired. It builds up until one day you just say no. And so Rosa lived on, quietly watching the world repeat itself. Done till one ordinary evening on December 1st, 1955, when the world gave her another insult. And this time, she gave it an answer. With silence. With calm. It was a cold December afternoon in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Louise Macaulay Parks walked toward the bus stop, not as a warrior, not as a protester, but as a woman carrying groceries. In a lifetime of quiet frustration. When she boarded the Cleveland Avenue bus, she had no idea that her name was about to echo through centuries. And yet every step she took that day was built on decades of silent resistance. She found a seat in the colored section, the middle of the bus. Legally, it was allowed unless a white person needed the spot, and soon one did. The bus driver, James Blake, asked her and 3 other black passengers to move. The others obeyed. Rosa didn't. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply said no. It wasn't just defiance. It was clarity. Single act of stillness that shook the foundations of segregation. James Blake called the police. They arrested her. A woman who paid her fare, who followed the law. Now in handcuffs for sitting still. Word spread like fire through the black community. A quiet seamstress had become a symbol. Because everyone knew, Rosa wasn't just tired, she was done. But Rosa Parks wasn't new to resistance. She had trained at the Highlander Folk School, a center for social justice. She had worked with the NAACP for years. This moment, it was no accident. It was a strategy. The arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. Leaders like E.D. Nixon, Joanne Robinson, and a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. stood beside her. In 24 hours, thousands refused to ride. They walked miles to work. Organized carpool systems, faced threats, violence and intimidation, but never gave in. The boycott lasted over a year. 381 days. 381 days of peaceful defiance. Rosa became the face of courage not through speeches or protests, but by holding her ground. One small seat, massive message. She lost her job. Her husband was harassed. They faced isolation, but not silence. Because the world had seen what one woman could do. The Supreme Court finally ruled bus segregation unconstitutional in 1956, and Rosa Parks. That quiet woman from Montgomery became the mother of the civil rights movement. But her journey didn't end there. What happened next will reveal the cost of becoming a symbol, the pain behind the progress. In the decades Rosa spent in the shadows of her own legacy, stay with us, because in the next chapter, we'll see the toll of heroism, the loneliness behind the spotlight, and how Rosa Parks kept rising even when the world moved on. The day everything changed, December 1st, 1955, it was a Thursday. The sun had set, and the air in Montgomery felt the same as every other night. But inside Rosa Parks, something had shifted. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight back. She simply said no, and that silence shook the world. December 1st, 1955, a bus, a decision. In history rewritten. Rosa had finished her day of work at the Montgomery Fair department store. She was tired, but not unusually so. As she waited at the Cleveland Avenue bus stop, she clutched her purse and quietly reflected on her husband. Raymond, on the young people she detrained in civil rights, and on the years of injustice that weighed silently on her shoulders. She wasn't planning a protest that day, but something inside her was different. It's number 2857, the Cleveland Avenue route. Rosa entered, paid her fare, and took a seat in the colored section. At the third stop, Several white passengers boarded. The bus filled. The driver, James Blake, noticed that the front white section was now full. He looked toward Rosa and 3 others seated just behind. "You all better make it light on yourselves, and let me have those seats," he said. 3 people quietly stood. Rosa did not. She moved slightly toward the window, but remained seated. The bus driver asked again. She looked him in the eye and said no. James Blake warned her, "If you don't stand up, I'll have to call the police." She replied softly, "You may do that," and he did. 2 officers arrived. Rosa did not resist. She did not shout. She simply got up, gathered her things, and walked off the bus, arrested for violating the segregation laws. But what the police didn't know was that her quiet defiance had just sparked a wildfire. News spread fast through whispers at dinner tables, through voices at churches, and through phone calls across Montgomery. The Women's Political Council, led by Joanne Robinson, immediately called for a 1-day bus boycott. The date, Monday, December 5th, the day of Rosa's trial. And in those 4 days leading up to it, Black Montgomery began organizing, uniting, and preparing to do the unthinkable, to stop riding the buses. A voice rises. The boycott begins when Rosa Parks was arrested. Many believed it would be forgotten by morning, but it wasn't. Because behind her quiet act, a city began to stir on. And from that silence, a voice rose. A young preacher, unknown, untested, and only 26 years old, but destined to change the world. A city unites. A boycott begins. And a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr. walks into history. Monday, December 5th, 1955, the boycott. The sun rose quietly on Montgomery. But for the first time, city buses were almost empty. Tens of thousands of black residents, maids, teachers, cooks, carpenters walked to work, some as far as 10 miles. They were not protesting in anger. They were walking in dignity. That evening, at the Holt Street Baptist Church, more than 5,000 people packed the streets. They came to hear a man most had never seen. His name, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. King stood at the pulpit, heart pounding. He wasn't planning to lead a movement, but the moment chose him. He spoke not of revenge, but of justice. Not of violence, but of love, unity, and civil rights. We are here this evening to say to those who have mistreated us so long that we are tired of being segregated and humiliated. His voice shook, then steadied. That night, a leader was born. And a new organization was formed, the Montgomery Improvement Association, with King as its president. 381 days of resistance. The boycott wasn't just 1 day, it lasted 381 days. People created carpool systems. Churches turned into dispatch centers. Mechanics volunteered. Local black taxi drivers charged only 10 cents, the same as a bus fare. It wasn't easy. People lost jobs, walked in the rain, were harassed and arrested. King's home was bombed. Still he stood. And Rosa Parks, now the quiet symbol of it all, stayed in the shadows, proud but humble. This wasn't just a bus boycott. It was a mass awakening. Behind the scenes, lawyers from the NAACP were working tirelessly. Their case, Browder v. Gale, arguing that bus segregation was unconstitutional. And finally, on June 5, 1956, a federal court ruled segregation on public buses is illegal. The city appealed, but on November 13th, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the ruling. Victory was coming. The world knew her name, but few knew her pain. The boycott ended. Segregation was struck down. Rosa Parks had won, but behind the headlines, she was left with no job, no safety, and no peace. The world knew her name, but not her pain, because while the movement moved forward, she paid the price in silence. The boycott ends, but her struggles begin. On December 20th, 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court order went into effect. Segregation on Montgomery buses was finally illegal. The boycott after 381 days was over. Black residents could sit wherever they chose. But for Rosa Parks, life didn't get better. She lost her job as a seamstress. Her husband Raymond also faced constant threats. They received death threats daily. Even black leaders began to avoid her, worried her presence would invite more trouble. She was a national icon, and yet she couldn't find work. A quiet move north and more silence in 1957, Rosa and Raymond moved to Detroit, hoping for peace. But peace didn't come easily. Detroit had its own deep racism. Jobs were still scarce. And Rosa, despite being known as the mother of the civil rights movement, struggled financially. She worked as a secretary. She cleaned houses. At times, she couldn't afford rent. Her name was etched in history, but she was left behind by the movement she helped start. Legacy builds, but quietly. In the 1960s and 70s, as the civil rights movement gained speed, Rosa Parks remained mostly out of the spotlight. She didn't march on Washington. She didn't give fiery speeches. She worked quietly behind the scenes with Congressman John Conyers in Detroit. She helped cases of housing discrimination, police brutality, and poverty. And even then, she was often overlooked by the very leaders she had inspired, but Rosa never complained. She believed the work mattered more than the recognition. Late recognition in her final years it was until the 1980s and 90s that Rosa Parks began to receive the full honors she deserved. She received over 40 honorary degrees. In 1996, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Bill Clinton. In 1999, she was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest honor from the U.S. government. But Rosa remained soft-spoken, humble. "I would like to be remembered," she once said, "as a person who wanted to be free, so other people could be free too." She passed away in 2005 at the age of 92. She didn't shout. She didn't fight. She just sat down and changed everything. The world almost missed the lesson. She was just one person. What if Rosa Parks had listened to her fear? What if she had stood up quietly and disappeared into history? The world came dangerously close to never knowing her name. Rosa's story isn't just history, it's a mirror. It's a reminder that the most powerful changes often begin in silence. One moment of quiet resistance, one decision to do what's right can ripple through history. Many people think courage is bold, loud, and fearless. But Rosa Parks showed us something different. True courage is quiet, it's personal, and it often comes when you're alone. She wasn't backed by a crowd. She was alone on that bus, facing arrest, facing backlash, facing the unknown. But she didn't move because she believed in something bigger than fear. So the question becomes, what are you sitting down for? What injustice do you quietly carry every day? What truth are you afraid to live? The man who walked so she could sit before Rosa sat, someone had to walk. Before the bus boycott made headlines, a quiet teacher, a forgotten pastor, a teenager nobody remembers took steps so she could sit. This is their part of the story, the names you were never told, the ones who stood in the background, so history could move forward. The teacher who whispered resistance. Long before 1955, a woman named Septima Clark was quietly training black citizens to read, write, and understand their rights. She wasn't in the headlines. She didn't lead marches. But her citizenship schools gave people the power to vote, speak, and think freely. Rosa Parks once said, "Without people like Septima, I would never have found my voice." The preacher who taught the power of sitting still. E.D. Nixon, a humble railway worker and organizer, was one of the first to recognize Rosa's quiet strength. When she was arrested, he was the one who called Martin Luther King Jr. and sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. But Nixon never stood in the spotlight. He was the bridge. Between her silence and the world's awakening, the girl before Rosa Parks, there was Claudette Colvin, just 15 years old, arrested for refusing to give up her bus seat 9 months before Rosa Parks did the same. But Claudette was young, poor, dark-skinned, and pregnant. Civil rights leaders thought her story would not represent well, so they waited, till Rosa came with a quiet presence, clean record, and calm fire. Still, Claudette's courage lit the fuse. The thousands who walked so she could sit. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. Over a year. Thousands of black workers walked to their jobs, in the heat, in the rain, in silence. They walked because Rosa Parks sat. They lost wages, time, safety, but they gained dignity. One teacher walked 12 miles a day. One janitor carried worn-out shoes in a paper bag. No interviews, no attention. Just quiet strength. She was tired, but not the way you think, they say. Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat because she was tired, and that's true. But not tired from work, she was tired of being ignored. Tired of being told to wait. Tired of being told who she was allowed to be. This part of her story has been simplified for decades. But the truth is deeper and far more powerful. The myth of accidental heroism. For years, the story was told like this. Rosa was just tired after work and happened to say no. But that's only part of the truth. And that version makes her look like an accidental hero instead of the trained, deliberate activist she really was. Rosa Parks had attended the Highlander Folk School where civil disobedience and nonviolent protests were carefully studied. She knew exactly what she was doing. And that makes her even more powerful. The power of calm resistance. She didn't shout, she didn't fight, she didn't beg. She simply said no, with a calmness that shook the system. Sometimes silence feels like thunder. Her face wasn't angry. It was tired of accepting less. That subtle difference is everything. The iconic photo and the man behind her. You've seen the photo. Rosa Parks sitting on a bus alone. But that photo was staged, taken days after the boycott began by a UPI journalist. And the white man behind her in the picture, that was a reporter too. The image wasn't spontaneous, but its emotion was real. Because by then, Rosa had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of quiet refusal. The years after the bus. After the boycott, Rosa Parks lost her job. Her husband was harassed. They were both blacklisted from work in Montgomery. They eventually moved to Detroit. No, she wasn't celebrated right away. For years, she lived in near poverty. She never stopped working. She volunteered. She helped youth in Detroit's poorest neighborhoods. She continued the fight in silence. Why the world needed her to be quiet, historians say. Rosa's calm image was carefully chosen to represent the movement. Because she was respectable, soft-spoken, and morally safe. But make no mistake, she was deeply radical in her belief that dignity is non-negotiable. The world was ready for a quiet woman, but they weren't ready for her deep fire. And even now, people forget she chose to make history. The boycott that broke the silence when one woman stayed seated. A city stood up. Not with riots, not with rage, but with a whispered refusal heard around the world. This is how a 381-day boycott born from silence broke the back of a system built on oppression. The walk heard around the world on December 5, 1955, 4 days. After Rosa's arrest, the Montgomery bus boycott began. Thousands of black residents stopped taking the bus overnight. They walked for miles, to work, to school, to church. Rain or shine, they walked, and every step said the same thing. We deserve more. Led by minds, not mobs, they formed carpools. Organized driver networks, printed flyers by hand, held quiet community meetings in churches. And leading them was a 26-year-old pastor no one knew yet. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he preached calm defiance, peaceful power, and nonviolent resistance. Rosa had lit the match, helped carry the flame. Systemic resistance and steady courage, the city tried to break them. Insurance companies canceled car policies. Police harassed carpool drivers. People were arrested on false charges, but they didn't stop, because something bigger than fear was moving them. Not noise, not chaos, just purpose. And behind it all, Rosa never once asked to be the center. She just kept showing up quietly, consistently. After 381 days, the Supreme Court ruled that bus segregation was unconstitutional. The boycott ended. But something had already changed. New kind of power had been born. Power without shouting. Leadership without ego. A revolution made of quiet steps and steady hearts. The quiet legacy. Rosa never asked to be a hero. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She just stayed seated. And that quiet act shook the ground beneath centuries of injustice. A life beyond the bus. After the boycott ended, Rosa's life wasn't easy. She faced job loss, threats, isolation. The world called her brave, but bravery came with a cost. Still, she stayed rooted in her values. Worked for congressmen, spoke at schools, mentored youth. She never chased fame. She chose meaning. The real lesson: most people think change needs volume, but Rosa's life proved the opposite. Real power is still. Real courage is calm. Real change begins inside. The moment you say no to injustice, even if your voice shakes, you create space for others to stand with you. or sit with you. Her story wasn't about a seat. It was about self-respect, how quiet dignity can become a nation's roar. What you can learn today: you don't need a platform or thousands of followers or the perfect words. You need one thing: conviction. Rosa didn't move nations with noise. She moved them with stillness. So when your moment comes, whether at school, work, or in silence, will you stand? Or will you, like Rosa, refuse to stand and let the world finally see the truth? If this story moved you, let it move others too. Like to keep her legacy alive? Comment below. What would you have done in Rosa's seat? Share this with one person who needs silent courage today. Subscribe to Still Rise for more.com/powerful stories that remind you greatness doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just sits down.